He walked onto the stage with a word scrawled across his cheek, a word that shocked the world: slave. This wasn't a publicity stunt, it was a declaration of war. To understand why Prince, one of the most successful artists on the planet, would brand himself a slave, you have to understand the gilded cage he was locked in. It all started with a contract, a piece of paper that made headlines across the globe: $100 million. In the early 90s, it was an astronomical sum, the biggest record deal in history. The media celebrated it as the ultimate validation of his genius. Warner Brothers paraded him as the crown jewel of their roster. They thought they had bought an artist for a new decade. They were wrong. They had inadvertently funded a revolution. The ink was barely dry when the deal, celebrated in press conferences with forced smiles, began to morph into a set of golden handcuffs. The executives at Warner Brothers were men of a certain era. They operated on quarterly reports, market research, and the sacred cow of radio airplay. They saw Prince not as a mystic channeler of sound, but as a high-performing asset, a brand that needed to be managed. The conversations shifted from art to commerce. "We need a single for the summer, Prince, something like Kiss. This guitar solo is 7 minutes long. The radio programmers won't touch it. Can we get an edit?" They demanded albums on a rigid schedule, a timetable completely alien to a man who created music as naturally as breathing. For Prince, an album was a snapshot of his soul at a particular moment. For the label, it was a product to be placed on a release calendar between a Madonna record and a movie soundtrack. This fundamental misunderstanding was the crack in the foundation that would bring the whole structure crashing down. Prince lived inside his studio in Paisley Park, a sprawling, sterile-looking compound in the middle of Minnesota that was anything but sterile on the inside. It was his temple. He would work for days on end, fueled by an energy that seemed otherworldly. He'd record entire albums in a matter of weeks, sometimes days, layering instruments, vocals, and harmonies into complex tapestries of sound. He would then present these finished masterpieces to the label, only to be met with hesitation. "This is brilliant, Prince, but we just released an album 6 months ago. The market needs to rest. Let's shelve it for next year." To him, this was blasphemy. It was like telling a painter to stop painting because the gallery walls were full. The music was pouring out of him, a torrent from another dimension, and men in suits were trying to build a dam. The vault, his now legendary repository of unreleased music, began to swell. It wasn't just a storage room, it became his sanctuary, the only place his music could be truly free, untouched by corporate hands. He started to realize they didn't just want to control his output, they wanted to own the source. The contract didn't just stipulate ownership of the master recordings, it asserted control over the name Prince itself. He had, in his eyes, signed away his very identity. He was trapped in a velvet prison, and he was about to stage the most bizarre and brilliant escape in music history.
The first shot in the war was not a song, but a symbol. In 1993, Prince Rogers Nelson, the name on his birth certificate and on his $100 million contract, ceased to exist. In his place was an unpronounceable glyph, a beautiful and baffling fusion of the male and female symbols, with a horn-like flourish that suggested something more, something transcendent. The world was utterly perplexed. The media, at a loss, simply called it the love symbol. Insiders whispered that the symbol came to him in a dream, a vision during a moment of deep meditation, a divine key to unlock his contractual prison. It was an act of profound metaphysical rebellion. He wasn't just changing his name, he was changing his essence. The reaction from Warner Brothers was one of pure panic. Imagine the emergency board meetings, the frantic calls between Los Angeles and New York. What do you mean he's not Prince anymore? How do we market an artist with no name? Is this even legal? It was a logistical and marketing nightmare. Prince had found their Achilles heel. They owned the name Prince, but they couldn't force a man to answer to it. In a move of beautiful, calculated disruption, his team sent out thousands of floppy disks containing a custom font of the symbol to press outlets and magazines around the world, just so they could write about him. He had made the most powerful media corporations on earth bend to his will. He was now, officially, the artist formerly known as Prince. Then came the next phase of the assault, the one that made the symbol look tame. He began appearing in public with the word slave written in elegant cursive script on his right cheek. It was a shocking, uncomfortable, and utterly brilliant act of protest. He was using his own famous face as a billboard for his cause. At award shows, amidst the glitz and glamour, he stood as a silent, branded dissenter. When interviewers asked him about it, his answers were cryptic and powerful. "I am not the one who is confused. If you don't own your masters, you're a slave." He was connecting his personal, multi-million-dollar struggle to a much larger historical pain, a move that was both controversial and undeniably potent. He was forcing the public to confront the uncomfortable truth behind the fantasy of the music industry. The world saw an eccentric genius spiraling into madness. Warner Brothers saw an asset that they could no longer control, an investment that was actively, publicly trying to devalue itself. They had no idea how far he was willing to take it, or that his next move would be to turn his own art into a weapon against them.
Behind the scenes, the war escalated into a campaign of surrealist artistic sabotage. Prince was a prolific creator, a fact that had once been his greatest asset to the label. Now, he turned that prolificity against them. He still owed them albums, and he would deliver them, but they would not be the albums they wanted. He began to systematically empty the more challenging, less commercial corners of his vault. Albums like Chaos and Disorder were delivered to the label's doorstep like ticking bombs. It was raw, angry, guitar-driven rock, filled with feedback and fury. It was brilliant, but it wasn't pop. There was no radio-friendly single, no easy hook for the masses. It was the sound of a man fulfilling a contractual obligation with a clenched fist and a screaming solo. But the legend from within Paisley Park speaks of an even more audacious move. A secret album, a recording so hostile it was known only as the Poison Pill. Some say it was titled The Phoenix, a reference to the career he was willing to burn to the ground to be reborn. The tales describe an album that was deliberately unlistenable. Tracks composed of industrial noise, atonal synthesizers, spoken word passages read from legal documents, and 20-minute drum solos that devolved into pure chaotic rhythm. It was a sonic middle finger, a masterpiece of anti-commercialism. The story goes that Prince, in a rare trip to the Warner Brothers headquarters in Los Angeles, convened a meeting with the entire executive board. He walked in, silent, dressed in a custom suit, the word slave still on his cheek. He didn't say a word. He simply placed the cassette on the polished boardroom table and nodded to an aide to press play. For the next hour, the executives were subjected to the poison pill. Their faces allegedly turned from confusion to anger to a kind of pale corporate terror. They were businessmen. They understood risk. But this was an act of pure, unpredictable artistic anarchy. He was holding his own career hostage. Releasing this album would not only lose them millions, it would actively alienate his global fan base and permanently tarnish the Prince brand they had so carefully cultivated. He was turning their greatest asset, his genius, into their most terrifying liability. He was speaking a language of creative chaos they couldn't comprehend, forcing them into a corner. In another act of defiance, it's believed he began strategically leaking his best, most soulful and funky material, the very music the label was desperate for, to bootleggers and fan clubs. He was undercutting his official releases, ensuring his true art reached his fans, while the label was left to sell the angry remnants of their broken contract. He was a lone warrior, isolated in his Minnesota fortress, fighting a corporate giant with the only weapons he had, his boundless creativity and his absolute refusal to be owned.
The emancipation of a legend, the final day of the contract, December 31st, 1999, was a day of liberation. Legend says a countdown was held at Paisley Park, quiet, joyful celebration as the final seconds of the millennium and his servitude ticked away. He was free. His first act as a free man was not a vacation or a party, but a tidal wave of music. He released Emancipation, a sprawling, ambitious 3-disc epic. It contained exactly 3 hours of music, 36 songs. The symbolism was potent. This was the sound of a man unshackled, a torrent of creative energy that had been suppressed for years. The album was a journey through funk, soul, pop, and rock, with lyrics that spoke of freedom, rebirth, and spiritual awakening. It was a statement. He wasn't just back, he was reborn. But his vision of freedom extended far beyond his own recording career. Prince had seen the future, and it was digital. While the rest of the music industry was fighting a losing battle against file sharing and clinging desperately to the sale of plastic discs, Prince embraced the internet. He launched the NPG Music Club, a groundbreaking subscription service that allowed him to sell his music directly to his fans. He was cutting out the entire corporate apparatus, the label, the distributors, the retailers. It was a revolutionary act that predated iTunes, Bandcamp, and Spotify by years. He was dismantling the very system he had just escaped, providing a blueprint for a new kind of artistic independence. The war with Warner Brothers had changed the industry, and it had changed him. The slave protest was not the act of a madman, it was the calculated, painful strategy of a visionary. He sacrificed his name, risked his global stardom, and endured years of public ridicule to prove a single powerful point. True art cannot be owned. He saw the industry's model for what it was, a form of indentured servitude, where artists, the source of all value, took all the creative risks while corporations reaped the lion's share of the rewards. His fight paved the way for future generations of artists, from Taylor Swift to Frank Ocean, to fight for ownership of their own work. The name on his cheek was a scar from a necessary war, a bizarre and beautiful testament to a man who would rather be a symbol of freedom than a king on a corporate throne. He didn't just escape the machine, he drew up the schematics for how to destroy it, securing his legacy not just as a musical genius, but as a true liberator.